Good evening and welcome back to Cecilia. You survived the previous episode, and I can't guarantee it's going to get any happier tonight. I'm going to try and read 2 chapters, but I had a really long and rather bad day, and I think I'm probably going to cry. So I've got a box of tissues and I've got a glass of water, and to be honest, I'm kind of crying now. But I'm going to press through because I really want to finish this book this week. So I think probably the quicker we get through it, the better at this point. Chapter 7. A Pursuit. The moment the porter came to the door, Cecilia eagerly called out from the coach, "Is Mr. Delvile here?" "Yes, madam," he answered, "but I believe he is engaged." "Oh, no matter for any engagement," cried she. "Open the door, I must speak to him this moment." "If you will please to step into the parlour, madam, I will tell his gentleman you are here, but he will be much displeased if he is disturbed without notice." "Ah, heaven!" exclaimed she. "What Mr. Delvile are you talking of?" "My master, madam." Cecilia, who had got out of the coach, now hastily returned to it, and was some time in too great agony to answer either the porter, who desired some message, or the coachman, who asked whither he was to drive. To see Mr. Delvile unprotected by his son, and contrary to his orders, appeared to her insupportable. Yet to what place could she go? Where was she likely to meet with Delvile? How could he find her if she went to Mrs. Hill's? And in what other house could she at present claim admittance? After a little recovering from this cruel shock, she ventured, though in a faltering voice, to inquire whether young Mr. Delvile had been there. "Yes, madam," the porter answered. "We thought he was abroad, but he called just now, and asked if any lady had been at the house. He would not even stay to go up to my master, and we have not dared tell him of his arrival." This a little revived her. To hear that he had actually been inquiring for her, at least assured her of his safety from any immediate violence, and she began to hope she might now possibly meet with him time enough to explain all that had passed in his absence, and occasioned her seemingly strange and suspicious situation at Belfield's. She compelled herself, therefore, to summon courage for seeing his father, since, as he had directed her to the house, she concluded he would return there to seek her, when he had wandered elsewhere to no purpose. She then, though with much timidity and reluctance, sent a message to Mr. Delvile to entreat a moment's audience. An answer was brought her that he saw no company so late at night. Losing now all dread of his reproaches in her superior dread of missing Delvile, she called out earnestly to the man, "Tell him, sir, I beseech him not to refuse me. Tell him I have something to communicate that requires his immediate attention." The servant obeyed, but soon returning, said his master desired him to acquaint her he was engaged every moment he stayed in town, and must positively decline seeing her. "Go to him again," cried the harassed Cecilia. "Assure him I come not from myself, but by the desire of one he most values. Tell him I entreat but permission to wait an hour in his house, and that I have no other place in the world whither I can go." Mr. Delvile's own gentleman brought, with evident concern, the answer to this petition, which was, that while the Honourable Mr. Delvile was himself alive, he thought the desire of any other person concerning his house was taking with him a very extraordinary liberty, and that he was now going to bed, and had given orders to his servants to carry him no more messages whatsoever upon pain of instant dismission. Cecilia now seemed totally destitute of all resource, and for a few dreadful minutes gave herself up to utter despondency. Nor, when she recovered her presence of mind, could she form any better plan than that of waiting in the coach to watch the return of Delvile. She told the coachman, therefore, to drive to a corner of the square, begging Mr. Simpkins to have patience, which he promised with much readiness, and endeavoured to give her comfort by talking without cessation. She waited here near half an hour. She then feared the disappointment of Delvile in not meeting her at first had made him conclude she meant not to obey his directions, and had perhaps urged him to call again upon Belfield, whom he might fancy privy to her non-appearance. This was new horror to her, and she resolved at all risks to drive to Portland Street, and inquire if Belfield himself was returned home. Yet, lest they should mutually be pursuing each other all night, she stopped again at Mr. Delvile's, and left word with the porter that if young Mr. Delvile should come home, he would hear of the person he was inquiring for at Mrs. Roberts' in Fetter Lane. To Belfield she did not dare to direct him, and it was her intention, if there she procured no new intelligence, to leave the same message and then go to Mrs. Roberts without further delay. To make such an arrangement with a servant who knew not her connection with his young master was extremely repugnant to her, but the exigence was too urgent for scruples, and there was nothing to which she would not have consented to prevent the fatal catastrophe she apprehended. When she came to Belfield, not daring to enter the house, she sent in Mr. Simpkins to desire that Mrs. Belfield would be so good as to step to the coach door. "Is your son, madam," she cried eagerly, "come home, and is anybody with him?" "No, ma'am, he has never once been across the threshold since that gentleman took him out, and I am half out of my wits to think—" "Has that gentleman," interrupted Cecilia, "been here any more?" "Yes, ma'am, that's what I was going to tell you. He came again just now and said—" "Just now! Good heaven! And which way is he gone?" "Why, he is after no good, I'm afraid, for he was in a great passion and would hardly hear anything I said." Pray answer me quick. Which way did he go?" "Why, he asked me if I knew whither my son was come from the coffee-house. Why, says I, I'm sure I can't tell, for if it had not been for Mr. Simpkins, I should not so much have known he ever went to the coffee-house. However, I hope he hasn't come away, because if he is, poor Miss Beverley will have had all that trouble for nothing, for she's gone after him in a prodigious hurry, and upon my only saying that, he seemed quite beside himself, and said if I don't meet with your son at the coffee-house myself, pray, when he comes in, tell him I shall be highly obliged to call there, and then he went away, in as great a pet as ever you saw." Cecilia listened to this account with the utmost terror and misery. The suspicions of Delvile would now be aggravated, and the message he had left for Belfield would by him be regarded as a defiance. Again, however, to the coffee-house she instantly ordered the coach, an immediate explanation from herself seeming the only possible chance for preventing the most horrible conclusion to this unfortunate and eventful evening. She was still accompanied by Mr. Simpkins, and, but that she attended to nothing he said, would not inconsiderably have been tormented by his conversation. She sent him immediately into the coffee-room, to inquire if either of the gentlemen were then in the house. He returned to her with a waiter, who said, "One of them, madam, called again just now, but he only stopped to write a note, which he left to be given to the gentleman who came with him at first. He is but this moment gone, and I don't think he can be at the bottom of the street." "Oh, drive then! Gallop after him!" cried Cecilia. "Coachman, go this moment!" "My horses are tired," said the man. "They have been out all day, and they will gallop no further if I don't stop and give them a drink." Cecilia, too full both of hope and impatience for this delay, forced open the door herself, and without saying another word, jumped out of the carriage, with intention to run down the street, but the coachman immediately seizing her, protested she should not stir till he was paid. In the utmost agony of mind at a hindrance by which she imagined Delvile would be lost to her perhaps for ever, she put up her hand in her pocket, in order to give up her purse for her liberty, but Mr. Simpkins, who was making a tiresome expostulation with the coachman, took it himself, and declaring he would not see the lady cheated, began a tedious calculation of his fare. "Oh, pay him anything," cried she, "and let us be gone. An instant delay may be fatal." Mr. Simpkins, too earnest to conquer the coachman to attend to her distress, continued his prolix harangue concerning a disputed shilling, appealing to some gathering spectators upon the justice of his cause, while his adversary, who was far from sober, still held Cecilia, saying the coach had been hired for the lady, and he would be paid by herself. "Good God!" cried the agitated Cecilia, "give him my purse at once. Give him everything he desires." The coachman, at this permission, increased his demands, and Mr. Simpkins, taking the number of his coach, protested he would summon him to the court of conscience the next morning. A gentleman, who then came out of the coffee-house, offered to assist the lady, but the coachman, who still held her arm, swore he would have his right. "Let me go! Let me pass!" cried she with increasing eagerness and emotion. "Detain me at your peril! Release me this moment! Only let me run to the end of the street! Good God! Good heaven! Detain me not for mercy!" Mr. Simpkins, humbly desiring her not to be in haste, began a formal apology for his conduct, but the inebriety of the coachman became evident. A mob was collecting. Cecilia, breathless with vehemence and terror, was encircled, yet struggled in vain to break away, and the stranger gentleman, protesting with sundry compliments he would himself take care of her, very freely seized her hand. This moment for the unhappy Cecilia teemed with calamity. She was wholly overpowered. Terror for Delvile, horror for herself, hurry, confusion, heat and fatigue all assailing her at once, while all means of repelling them were denied her. The attack was too strong for her fears, feelings, and faculties, and her reason suddenly yet totally failing her, she madly called out, "He will be gone! He will be gone, and I must follow him to Nice!" The gentleman now retreated, but Mr. Simpkins, who was talking to the mob, did not hear her, and the coachman, too much intoxicated to perceive her rising frenzy, persisted in detaining her. "I am going to France," cried she, still more wildly. "Why do you stop me? He will die if I do not see him. He will bleed to death." The coachman, still unmoved, began to grow very abusive, but the stranger, touched by compassion, gave up his attempted gallantry, and Mr. Simpkins, much astonished, entreated her not to be frightened. She was, however, in no condition to listen to him. With a strength hitherto unknown to her, she forcibly disengaged herself from her persecutors. Yet her senses were wholly disordered. She forgot her situation, her intention, and herself. The single idea of Delvile's danger took sole possession of her brain, though all connection with its occasion was lost, and the moment she was released she fervently clasped her hands, exclaiming, "I will yet heal his wound, even at the hazard of my life," and springing forward was almost instantly out of sight. Mr. Simpkins now, much alarmed, and earnestly calling after her, entered into a compromise with the coachman, that he might attend her, but the length of his negotiation defeated its purpose, and before he was at liberty to follow her, all trace was lost by which he might have overtaken her. He stopped every passenger he met to make inquiries, but though they led him on some way, they led him on in vain, and after a useless and ill-managed pursuit, he went quietly to his own home, determining to acquaint Mrs. Belfield with what had happened the next morning. Meanwhile the frantic Cecilia escaped both pursuit and insult by the velocity of her own motion. She called aloud upon Delvile as she flew to the end of the street. No Delvile was there. She turned the corner, yet saw nothing of him. She went still on, though unknowing whither, the distraction of her mind every instant growing greater, from the inflammation of fatigue, heat, and disappointment. She was spoken to repeatedly. She was even caught once or twice by her riding habit, but she forced herself along by her own vehement rapidity, not hearing what was said, not heeding what was thought. Delvile, leading by the arm of Belfield, was the image before her eyes, and took such full possession of her senses that still, as she ran on, she fancied it in view. She scarce touched the ground. She scarce felt her own motion. She seemed as if endued with supernatural speed, gliding from place to place, from street to street, with no consciousness of any plan, and following no direction than that of darting forward wherever there was most room, and turning back when she met with any obstruction, till, quite spent and exhausted, she abruptly ran into a yet open shop, where, breathless and panting, she sunk upon the floor, and with a look disconsolate and helpless sat for some time without speaking. The people of the house, concluding at first she was a woman of the town, were going to roughly turn her out, but upon seeing their mistake by the evident distraction of her air and manner, they inquired of some idle people, who, late as it was, had followed her, if any of them knew who she was or whence she came. They could give no account of her, but supposed she was broke loose from Bedlam. Cecilia then, wildly starting up, exclaimed, "No, no, I am not mad. I am going to Nice, to my husband." "She's quite crazy," said the man of the house, who was a pawnbroker. "We had better get rid of her before she goes mischievous." "She's broken out from some private madhouse, I dare say," said a man who had followed her into the shop, "and if you were to take care of her a little while, 10 to 1 but you'll get a reward for it." "She's a gentlewoman, sure enough," said the mistress of the house, "because she's got such good things on." And then, under pretence of trying to find some direction to her upon a letter or paper, she insisted upon searching her pockets. Here, however, she was disappointed in her expectations. Her purse was in the custody of Mr. Simpkins, but neither her terror nor distress had saved her from the daring dexterity of villainy, and her pockets in the mob had been rifled of whatever else they contained. The woman therefore hesitated some time whether to take charge of her or not, but being urged by the man who made the proposal, and who said they might depend upon seeing her soon advertised as having escaped from her keepers, they ventured to undertake her. Meanwhile she endeavoured again to get out, calling aloud upon Delvile to rescue her, but so wholly bereft of sense and recollection, she could give no account who she was, whence she came, or whither she wished to go. They then carried her upstairs. And attempted to make her lie down upon a bed, but supposing she refused because it was not of straw, they desisted, and taking away the candle, locked the door, and all went to rest. In this miserable condition, alone and raving, she was left to pass the night. In the early part of it she called upon Delvile without intermission, beseeching him to come to her defence in one moment, and deploring his death the next. But afterwards, her strength being wholly exhausted by these various exertions and fatigues, she threw herself upon the floor and lay for some minutes quite still. Her head then began to grow cooler, as the fever into which terror and immoderate exercise had thrown her abated, and her memory recovered its functions. This was, however, only a circumstance of horror to her. She found herself shut up in a place of confinement, without light, without knowledge where she was, and not a human being near her. Yet the same returning reason which enabled her to take this view of her own situation brought also to her mind that in which she had left Delvile. Under all the perturbation of new-kindled jealousy, just calling upon Belfield, tenacious of his honour even more than himself, to satisfy doubts of which the very mention would be received as a challenge. Oh yet, cried she, let me fly and overtake them. I may yet find them before morning, and tonight it must surely have been too late for this work of death. She then arose to feel for the door, and succeeded, but it was locked, and no effort she could make enabled her to open it. Her agony was unspeakable. She called out with violence upon the people of the house, conjured them to set her at liberty, offered any reward for their assistance, and threatened them with the prosecution if detained. Nobody, however, came near her. Some slept on, notwithstanding all the disturbance she could make, and others, though awakened by her cries, concluded them the ravings of a madwoman, and listened not to what she said. Her head was by no means in a condition to bear this violence of distress. Every pulse was throbbing, every vein seemed bursting. Her reason, so lately returned, could not bear the repetition of such a shock, and from supplicating for help with all energy of feeling and understanding, she soon continued the cry from mere vehemence of distraction. Thus dreadfully passed the night, and in the morning, when the woman of the house came to see her, she found her raving with such frenzy and desperation that her conscience was perfectly at ease in the treatment she had given her, being now firmly satisfied she required the strictest confinement. She still, however, tried to get away, talked of Delvile without cessation, said she should be too late to serve him, told the woman she desired but to prevent murder, and repeatedly called out, "Oh, beloved of my heart, wait but a moment, and I will snatch thee from destruction." Mrs. Wyers, this woman, now sought no longer to draw from her whence she came or who she was, but heard her frantic exclamations without any emotion, contentedly concluding that her madness was incurable, and though she was in a high fever, refused all sustenance, and had every symptom of an alarming and dangerous malady, she was fully persuaded that her case was that of decided insanity, and had not any notion of temporary or accidental alienation of reason. All she could think of, by way of indulgence to her, was to bring her a quantity of straw, having heard that mad people were fond of it, and putting it in a heap in one corner of the room, she expected to see her eagerly fly to it. Cecilia, however, distracted as she was eager for nothing but to escape, which was constantly her aim, alike when violent or when quiet. Mrs. Wyers, finding this, kept her closely confined, and the door always locked, whether absent or present. Chapter 8. An Encounter. 2 whole days passed thus. No inquiries reached Mrs. Wyers, and she found in the newspapers no advertisement. Meanwhile Cecilia grew worse every moment, tasted neither drink nor food, raved incessantly, called out 20 times in a breath, "Where is he? Which way's he gone?" and implored the woman by the most pathetic remonstrances to save her unhappy Delvile, dearer to her than life, more precious than peace or rest. At other times she talked of her marriage, of the displeasure of his family, and of her own remorse, entreated the woman not to betray her, and promised to spend the remnant of her days in the heaviness of sorrow and contrition. Again her fancy roved, and Mr. Monckton took sole possession of it. She reproached him for his perfidy, she bewailed that he was massacred, she would not a moment outlive him, and wildly declared her last remains should moulder in his hearse. and thus, though naturally and commonly of a silent and quiet disposition, she was now not a moment still, for the irregular starts of a terrified and disordered imagination were changed into the constant ravings of morbid delirium. The woman, growing uneasy from her uncertainty of pay for her trouble, asked the advice of some of her friends what was proper for her to do, and they counselled her to put an advertisement into the papers herself the next morning. The following, therefore, was drawn up and sent to the printer of the Daily Advertiser. Madness. Whereas a crazy young lady, tall, fair-complexioned, with blue eyes and light hair, ran into the 3 Blue Balls in something street on Thursday night, the 2d instant, and has been kept there since out of charity. She was dressed in a riding habit. Whoever she belongs to is desired to send after her immediately. She has been treated with the utmost care and tenderness. She talks much of some person by the name of Delvile. N.B. She has no money about her. May, 1780. This had but just been sent off, when Mr. Wyers, the man of the house, coming upstairs, said, "Now we shall have 2 of 'em, for here's the crazy old gentleman below, that says he has just heard in the neighbourhood of what has happened to us, and he desires to see the poor lady." "It's as well let him come up then," answered Mrs. Wyers, "for he goes to all sorts of places and people, and 10 to 1 but he'll bustle about till he finds out who she is." Mr. Wyers then went downstairs to send him up. He came instantly. It was Albany. It was Albany, who in his vagrant rambles, having heard an unknown mad lady was at this pawnbroker's, came, with his customary eagerness, to visit and serve the unhappy, to see what could be done for her. When he entered the room, she was sitting upon the bed, her eyes earnestly fixed upon the window, from which she was privately indulging a wish to make her escape. Her dress was in much disorder, her fine hair was dishevelled, and the feathers of her riding hat were broken and half falling down, some shading her face, others reaching to her shoulder. "Poor lady!" cried Albany, approaching her. "How long has she been in this state?" She started at the sound of a new voice. She looked round, but what was the astonishment of Albany to see who it was? He stepped back, he came forward, he doubted his own senses, he looked at her earnestly, he turned from her to look at the woman of the house, he cast his eyes round the room itself, and then, lifting up his hands, "Oh, sight of woe!" he cried, "the generous and good, the kind reliever of distress, the benign sustainer of misery! Is this Cecilia?" Cecilia, imperfectly recollecting, though not understanding him, sunk down at his feet, tremblingly called out, "Oh, if he is yet to be saved! If already he is not murdered, go to him, fly after him. You will presently overtake him. He is only in the next street. I left him there myself, his sword drawn and covered with human blood." "Such powers of kindness and compassion!" cried the old man. "Look upon this creature with pity. She who raised the depressed, she who cheered the unhappy, she whose liberal hand turned lamentations into joy, who never with a tearless eye could hear the voice of sorrow. Is this she herself? Can this be Cecilia?" "Oh, do not wait to talk," cried she. "Go to him now, or you will never see him more. The hand of death is on him. Cold of clay is its touch. He is breathing his last. Oh, murdered Delvile, massacred husband of my heart, groan not so piteously. Fly to him and weep over him. Fly to him and pluck the poniard from his wounded bosom." "Oh, sounds of anguish and horror!" cried the melted moralist, tears running quick down his rugged cheeks. "Melancholy indeed is this sight, humiliating to morality. Such is human strength, such human frailty, weak as our virtues, frail as our guilty natures." "Ah!" cried she more wildly, "no one will save me now. I am married, and no one will listen to me. Ill were the auspices under which I gave my hand. Oh, it was a work of darkness, unacceptable and offensive. It has been sealed, therefore, with blood, and tomorrow it will be signed with murder." "Poor distracted creature!" exclaimed he. "Thy pangs I have felt, but thy innocence I have forfeited. My own wounds bleed afresh, my own brain threatens new frenzy." Then starting up, "Good woman," he added, "kindly attend her. I will seek out her friends, put her into bed, comfort, soothe, compose her. I will come to you again, and as soon as I can." He then hurried away. "Oh, hour of joy!" cried Cecilia. He has gone to rescue him. Oh, blissful moment! He will yet be snatched from slaughter. The woman lost not an instant in obeying the orders she had received. She was put into bed, and nothing was neglected as far as she had power and thought to give a look of decency and attention to her accommodations. He had not left them an hour when Mary, the maid who had attended her from Suffolk, came to inquire for her lady. Albany, who was now wandering over the town in search of some of her friends, and who entered every house where he imagined she was known, had hastened to that of Mrs. Hill the first of any, as he was well acquainted with her obligations to Cecilia. Therefore Mary herself, by the directions which her lady had given Mrs. Belfield, had gone, and there, in the utmost astonishment and uneasiness, had continued till Albany brought news of her. She was surprised and afflicted beyond measure, not only at the state of her mind and her health, but to find her in a bed and apartment so unsuitable to her rank of life, and so different to what she had ever been accustomed. She wept bitterly while she inquired at the bedside how her lady did, but wept still more when, without answering or seeming to know her, Cecilia started up and called out, "I must be removed this moment. I must go to St. James's Square. If I stay an instant longer, the passing bell will toll, and then how shall I be in time for the funeral?" Mary, alarmed and amazed, turned hastily from her to the woman of the house, who calmly said the lady was only in a raving fit and must not be minded. Extremely frightened at this intelligence, she entreated her to be quiet and lie still, but Cecilia grew suddenly so violent that force only could keep her from rising, and Mary, unused to dispute her commands, prepared to obey them. Mrs. Wyers now in her turn imposed in vain. Cecilia was peremptory, and Mary became implicit, and though not without much difficulty, she was again dressed in her riding habit. This operation over, she moved towards the door, the temporary strength of delirium giving her a hardiness that combated fever, illness, fatigue, and feebleness. Mary, however averse and fearful, assisted her, and Mrs. Wyers, compelled by the obedience of her own servant, went before them to order a chair. Cecilia, however, felt her weakness when she attempted to move downstairs. Her feet tottered, and her head became dizzy. She leaned it against Mary, who called aloud for more help, and made her sit down till it came. Her resolution, however, was not to be altered. A stubbornness, wholly foreign to her genuine character, now made her stern and positive, and Mary, who thought her submission indispensable, cried, but did not offer to oppose her. Mr. and Mrs. Wyers both came up to assist in supporting her, and Mr. Wyers offered to carry her in his arms, but she would not consent. When she came to the bottom of the stairs, her head grew worse. She again leant it upon Mary, but Mr. Wyers was obliged to hold them both. She still, however, was firm in her determination, and was making another effort to proceed, when Delvile rushed hastily into the shop. He had just encountered Albany, who, knowing his acquaintance, though ignorant of his marriage with Cecilia, had informed him where to seek her. He was going to make inquiry if he was come to the right house, when he perceived her, feeble, shaking, leaning upon one person and half carried by another. He started back, staggered, gasped for breath, but finding they were proceeding, advanced with trepidation, furiously calling out, "Hold! Stop! What is it you are doing? Monsters of savage barbarity, are you murdering my wife?" The well-known voice no sooner struck the ears of Cecilia, than instantly recollecting it, she screamed, and in suddenly endeavouring to spring forward, fell to the ground. Delvile vehemently advanced to catch her in his arms and save her fall, which her unexpected quickness had prevented her attendants from doing, but the sight of her changed complexion and the wildness of her eyes and air again made him start. His blood froze through his veins, and he stood looking at her, cold and almost petrified. Her own recollection of him seemed lost already, and exhausted by the fatigue she had gone through in dressing and coming downstairs, she remained still and quiet, forgetting her design of proceeding, and forming no new one for returning. Mary, to whom, as all her fellow servants, the marriage of Cecilia had been known, before she left the country, now desired from Delvile directions what was to be done. Delvile, starting suddenly at this call from the deepest horror into the most desperate rage, fiercely exclaimed, "Inhuman wretches! Unfeeling, execrable wretches! What is it you have done to her? How came she hither? Who brought her? Who dragged her? By what infamous usage has she been sunk into this state?" "Indeed, sir, I don't know," cried Mary. "I assure you, sir," said Mrs. Wires. "The lady—" "Peace!" cried he furiously. "I will not hear your falsehoods. Peace, and begone!" Then casting himself upon the ground by her side, "Oh, my Cecilia!" he cried, "where hast thou been thus long? How have I lost you? What dreadful calamity has befallen thee? Answer me, my love. Raise your sweet head and answer me. Speak, say to me anything. The bitterest words will be mercy to this silence." Cecilia, then suddenly looking up, called out with great quickness, "Who are you?" "Who am I?" cried he, amazed and affrighted. "I should be glad you would go away," cried she in a hurrying manner, "for you are quite unknown to me." Delvile, unconscious of her insanity, and attributing to resentment this aversion and repulse, hastily moved from her, mournfully answering, "Well, indeed, may you disclaim me, refuse all forgiveness, load me with hatred and reproach, and consign me to eternal anguish. I have merited severer punishment still. I have behaved like a monster, and I am abhorrent to myself." Cecilia now, half rising and regarding him with mingled terror and anger, eagerly exclaimed, "If you do not mean to mangle and destroy me, begone this instant." "To mangle you!" repeated Delvile, shuddering. "How horrible! But I deserve it. Look not, however, so terrified, and I will tear myself away from you. Suffer me but to assist in removing you from this place, and I will only watch you at a distance, and never see you more till you permit me to approach you." Why?" cried Cecilia, with a look of perplexity and impatience. "Will you not tell me your name, and where you come from?" "Do you not know me?" cried he, struck with new horror, "or do you only mean to kill me by the question?" "Do you bring me any message from Mr Monckton?" "From Mr Monckton? No, but he lives and will recover." "I thought you had been Mr Monckton yourself." "Too cruel, yet justly cruel, Cecilia. Is then Delvile utterly renounced? The guilty, the unhappy Delvile, is he cast off for ever? Have you driven him wholly from your heart? Do you deny him even a place in your remembrance?" "Is your name then Delvile?" "Oh, what is it you mean? Is it me or my name you thus disown?" "It is a name," cried she, sitting up, "I well remember to have heard, and once I loved it, and 3 times I called upon it in the dead of night, and when I was cold and wretched I cherished it, and when I was abandoned and left alone, I repeated it and sung to it." "All gracious powers!" cried Delvile, "her reason is utterly gone." And hastily rising, he desperately added, "What is death to this blow? Cecilia, I am content to part with thee." Mary now and Mrs Wires poured upon him eagerly as an account of her illness and insanity, her desire of removal, and their inability to control her. Delvile, however, made no answer. He scarce heard them. The deepest despair took possession of his mind, and rooted to the spot where he stood, he contemplated in dreadful stillness the fallen and altered object of his best hopes and affections. Already in her faded cheeks and weakened frame, his agonizing terror read the quick impending destruction of all his earthly happiness. The sight was too much for his fortitude, and almost for his understanding, and when his woe became unutterable, he wrung his hands, and groaning aloud, called out, "Art thou gone so soon? My wife, my Cecilia, have I lost thee already?" Cecilia, with utter insensibility to what was passing, now suddenly, and with a rapid yet continued motion, turned her head from side to side, her eyes wildly glaring, yet apparently regarding nothing. "Dreadful! Dreadful!" exclaimed Delvile. "What a sight is this!" And turning from her to the people of the house, he angrily said, "Why is she here upon the floor? Could you not even allow her a bed? Who attends her? Who waits upon her? Why has nobody sent for help? Don't answer me, I will not hear you. Fly this moment for a physician. Bring 2, bring 3, bring all you can find." Then, still looking from Cecilia, whose sight he could no longer support, he consulted with Mary whither she should be conveyed, and as the night was far advanced, and no place was prepared for her elsewhere, they soon agreed she could only be removed upstairs. Delvile now attempted to carry her in his arms, but trembling and unsteady, he had not strength to sustain her. Yet not enduring to behold the helplessness he could not assist, he conjured them to be careful and gentle, and committing her to their trust, ran out himself for a physician. Cecilia resisted them with her utmost power, imploring them not to bury her alive, and averring she had received intelligence they meant to entomb her with Mr Monckton. They put her, however, to bed, but her raving grew still more wild and incessant. Delvile soon returned with a physician, but had not courage to attend him to her room. He waited for him at the foot of the stairs, where, hastily stopping him, "Well, sir," he cried, "is it not all over? Is it not impossible she can live?" "She is very ill indeed, sir," he answered, "but I have given directions which perhaps—" "Perhaps!" interrupted Delvile, shuddering. "Do not stab me with such a word. She is very delirious," he continued, "but as her fever is very high, that is not so material. If the orders I have given take effect and the fever is got under, all the rest should be well of course." He then went away, leaving Delvile as much thunderstruck by answers so alarming, as if he had consulted him in full hope, and without even suspicion of her danger. The moment he recovered from his shock, he flew out of the house for more advice. He returned and brought with him 2 physicians. They confirmed the directions already given, but would pronounce nothing decisively of her situation. Delvile, half mad with the acuteness of his misery, charged them all with want of skill, and rode instantly into the country for Dr. Lister. He went out himself in search of a messenger to ride off express, though it was midnight, with his letter, and then, returning, he was hastening to her room, but while yet at the door, hearing her still raving, his horror conquered his eagerness, and hurrying downstairs, he spent the remnant of the long and seemingly endless night in the shop. Well, we have 2 chapters left. Have a good evening.